Hello, everyone, and welcome to the City and Crumpets podcast. I'm Hikmat Jamal, here sitting with today's guest, Shawn Micallef. Shawn is a columnist for the Toronto Star, co-founder of Spacing Magazine, author of 4 books, most recently Frontier City, and instructor at the University of Toronto. He is passionate about urban issues in the city. Hello, Shawn. How are you?
Hi. Good. How's it going?
I'm good. Everything's been with the coronavirus hit in March, and I know it might get a bit tedious, everyone talking about the coronavirus all the time. But when it did hit in March, in Toronto in particular, things started falling one by one, with the schools, graduations, the NBA, just the important things. But in all seriousness, on May 8th, Sidewalk Labs canceled their Toronto Quayside waterfront project. And for starters, for those of us who might not know, what is Sidewalk Labs?
Sidewalk Labs is they were a subsidiary of Google, so sometimes they're called Google Sidewalk. The Sidewalk was a company that Google set up to look into, urban planning, city building, for lack of a better term. They had a real kind of smart city, bent to it. And then the first major testing ground they're based in New York, but the first place that they sort of landed on was Toronto's waterfront, a relatively small compared to the rest of waterfront parcel of land, yet undeveloped, post-industrial, and with a deal that they made with Waterfront Toronto, the organization that kind of oversees waterfront development, we're able to plan to use it sort of as like a testing sandbox, testing case for a lot of the stuff that they've been working on. And they do work on they've got some interesting folks working for them, and they came up with all kinds of ideas, pie in the sky things that kind of probably will never actually be. But it was interesting to see that they were giving up this amount of space to do it. And Toronto was the place they focused on.
Okay. And this was in the works for how long? Because it's been in the news for quite a while. Roughly how long has it been since?
I think it was about 2 or 3 years, maybe 2 years. Again, I forget exactly when the first announcement came in. It did cause like a huge ripple. I mean, I remember follow a few techie people in California and elsewhere on Twitter and other social media, and they were all abuzz that, oh look, their sidewalks going to Toronto. And I think maybe before some Toronto people, and possibly me included, thought it was a big deal. Other people thought it was a big deal for good and bad. It was interesting to see some of the tech skeptics that I follow were immediately skeptical, and some of the kind of, not city boosters, but people who were are into trying things were really excited about it. So it was really interesting how even early on the sidewalk coming to Toronto not divided people, but people were in decidedly different camps. A lot of them, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hot issue for sure. Like, I've been seeing it in the news. Like you said, for 2 years, it's pretty regularly you'll see articles all across, whether from Toronto Star, CBC, whatnot. And I just want to be clear about one thing, and just kind of get your take on this. So the official cancellation, the reasons given were that it was an economic decision. Because of the coronavirus, because of unprecedented economic uncertainty. And, in 2019, their CEO, he went on TVO, Dan Doctroff, I believe, and he said, and I quote, he said, they would not cut and run, alluding to companies like Amazon. They would have the hard conversations with, policymakers and citizens. What is your take on this? I know it might not be a clear answer if 100% economic, 100% other issues, but is this purely an economic decision? Is Sidewalk Labs, or are they cutting and running here?
Yeah, I don't have inside information on that, but my speculation is it was kind of a cut and run, especially when you say you're not going to cut and run. And if anyone can weather the this coronavirus pandemic crisis, it's Google. They have the deepest pockets in the world. Um, so my theory is Toronto has a really, really long history of civic engagement, concerned citizens rising up to oppose things or support things, and for better and for worse. Sometimes it goes both ways. But you probably won't find a more formidable, maybe as formidable, but not a more formidable civil society in at least North America than Toronto, and a long, decades-long history of this sort of thing, stopping expressways in the early 1970s that were going to go through the middle of the city. And so that long heritage kind of like, if there was any city that wasn't going to let Sidewalk kind of just walk in and do what they want, Toronto was it. And I wonder if, was that too much trouble? I know from Sidewalk's perspective that the some of the resistance was actually they liked it because it was like a training ground. Like if we can beat this in Toronto, or if we can negotiate on Toronto terms, we'll be able to go into other cities a lot easier. But maybe Toronto was a little bit,
Yeah.
maybe the resistance was, or was just too much effort. Why not go to a city that you could just kind of walk in and do whatever you want? But what you mentioned, the whole idea of cut and run, is interesting because this gets down to, for me at least, the crux of one of the cruxes of the problem, that Google Sidewalk wanted to sort of behave like a government, right? They wanted to plan this entire section of the city and kind of run all the systems, from garbage pickup and other kind of interesting environmental, innovative things. But when the going gets tough, a government doesn't leave, and if they do, that's a failed state. So that's, I think, the I think it really illustrated why, or highlighted that the services that governments provide they're in here for the long haul. They're not going anywhere. Whereas a company like Google, as rich as they are, can promise everything and we'll be here forever. We're your best friends. But they can, within an hour of that announcement coming, you're gone.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. That's essentially mentioned that there's a distinction between government and a company at the end of the day, because they can, get up and leave. And just going back to some of the issues with, from the beginning, some of the topics that people were talking about. So particularly one of the things that stood out to me was this issue of transparency. And I want to get your take on this, with, especially even if you want to explain the waterfront, Toronto, how that works, like their relationship with the city, where they are in the legislative process. Are they a government body? Are they just an organization? They're private, that kind of thing. And then where did Sidewalk Labs go wrong in how they dealt with the city and their elected council members?
Waterfront Toronto started in the 90s. I want to say late 90s. Been a little fuzzy on the date. And the waterfront in Toronto was a, kind of deindustrialized place. It was very dirty. Apart from the kind of center part right downtown that was developed in the 80s a little bit and around Harbourfront. It was mostly, a lot of it was, like old railway lands and former industry, so it needed a lot of cleanup. It still does in certain sections, and that work is ongoing. And Waterfront Toronto was a tripartite organization, government organization set up jointly between City of Toronto, Province of Ontario, and the federal government of Canada. And each kind of contributed their funding to it. So it was a really interesting organization that they had like these three levels of authority kind of to do stuff. And in Toronto, there's a lot of cynicism around the waterfront. I think people are like, and it goes back decades, especially with older people, whoever you want to define it, whoever has longer memories. But the lake used to be dirty, right? Ontario had a bad reputation, like a lot of Great Lakes. Much cleaner now. You can swim in it, everything. So the lake and the waterfront have always kind of had this kind of taint to them, and the pace of redevelopment on the waterfront was slow, especially at first. There were also a couple bad developments that happened before, so people think like bad things happen on the waterfront. So anyway, there's all the cynicism around it. But Waterfront Toronto engaged in like a decade of community consultation and work, getting buy-in from different organizations and residents in Toronto for the plans that they had, and they developed that are still on the books. They're still going to happen. Knock wood. A lot of people bought into and supported. What was interesting when the Ford government, Rob Ford was elected mayor, one of the things he and his brother Doug, or this might have been just Doug's idea, was the Ferris wheel deal, and that got a lot of press. And that was there's going to be like a big mega mall or something on the waterfront. Ferris wheel is not a terrible idea, but it sort of became the figurehead for this bigger plan that was going to bulldoze all these earlier plans. And there was a kind of citizen revolt in Toronto, and the Ford ultimately, to make a long story short, backed down.
Interesting.
There's no Ferris wheel there. So it was one of the early, between that and attacking the library, it was one of the early times that Rob and Doug Ford backed down from their agenda early on, and that was because Waterfront Toronto did all this work for years. People trusted them, and I think when Sidewalk came in with these plans, and this is probably where Waterfront Toronto made a mistake, that it didn't do the same amount of work. It all happened a lot faster. It felt like the agreement between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk seemed murky. It wasn't as maybe transparent as it was, but it made people suspicious because it didn't have the same amount of community work, endless consultations and meetings and that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of early on, and I know this is something that really bothered me. One of the few times I actually wrote about Sidewalk was there were a number of people in Toronto that kind of got on board Sidewalk, which is fine, but the communication tone and content coming out of Sidewalk that was often parroted by some of these kind of Toronto boosters was that nothing happened on the waterfront. Nothing's going to happen unless Sidewalk comes in, and this is an opportunity we can't give up, or we're still going to have this crappy waterfront. Which is not true, right? Stuff was happening. It was just happening slow because it's a democracy and because it relied on the market forces to come in and build condos and the rest of it. So I think it overrode that community work, and that's when it's sort of like, at least the communication line of Sidewalk and Waterfront Toronto sort of became untrustworthy.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then also I think along with transparency, you also mentioned the issue of privacy too, right? Because Google, a big tech company, I assume the data would be pretty valuable for whatever reasons, right? Whether it's the collection of people's movements, garbage, snow, whatever, all this crazy tech stuff going on. Was there at any point, was it a major issue of the data, or was it pretty understood that the data wasn't going to be used by Google for whatever reasons, or was it more of an open source kind of thing?
They said it wouldn't be used. They kept giving assurances that, but it never. At least it didn't seem concrete. It was still sort of hypothetical. It wasn't done yet. But you think about how does Google make their money? We have Gmails for free, right? They're not giving it to us for free. They scrape our emails for information. Why is Google involved in city building? It wasn't about the real estate. They could with their billions and billions of dollars, they could become real estate moguls if they wanted to. But it was about the data of how we move around the city. Knowing how a human operates throughout the day is incredibly valuable. What stores catch their attention, what this, what that. So a lot of smart people who are very dedicated to data privacy and these issues were ringing alarm bells. A group in Toronto called Block Sidewalk really kind of pushed that side of it, and I think the assurances that Google was giving, Sidewalk was giving. I don't know if it convinced enough people.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think even you've mentioned a couple of times as well that they weren't necessarily into the real estate or the property aspect of it, but more so the governance. Google wanted to run a city in a sense, without the other things that come along with governance typically, right?
Yeah,
Dealing with
yeah.
citizens and whatnot. But perhaps some people will say that private cities are good. If you run it like a business, with each city marketing itself, providing XYZ services or goods. Citizens ideally would be choosing cities that align with their values, right? And there are examples of this. Private cities aren't just a Toronto thing. Toyota is building a city in Japan. There's a Masdar city in the UAE, Songdo in South Korea. Examples in Australia, Florida, and Sidewalk Labs as well, which is one of the bigger ones in the media, especially because it is Toronto after all. What are your thoughts on this idea of charter cities or private cities? And is that a realistic? Is that something that could happen in the future more often with cities governing, private cities and competing for citizens in a sense?
Yeah. I wonder, like, would a private city be worth living in? Like, would it be interesting? Would it be like one of the great things about cities is the chaos and um, the layers of people and competing interests. And if it was privately owned, if decisions could come from the top, and what would you do? What rights would you have as a citizen? All that stuff would need to be sorted out in a way. And there even in the past, there were interesting private cities in a way, like industrial towns. Like I'm from Windsor, Ontario, and Hiram Walker, the distiller of Canadian Club whiskey, right on the river, on the Detroit River, there's Walkerville, which was sort of built by Hiram Walker, the company for the workers to live, and there were other cases around like that, but they ended up being kind of consumed by the bigger city that they were with, and they weren't truly private cities. Cities right now, like they still compete, even though we are as democratic entities. City of Toronto has a department of economic was not economic prosperity, but economic development. And they go on trade missions. The mayor goes on trade missions to try to drum up tech businesses, especially come to Toronto. We are the San Francisco of Toronto or whatever. And so they compete in their own way, even though they're democracies. But yeah, I don't know if I need to go. I've never been to a true private city, but would they be the interesting, chaotic, especially free places that our very what's the word I'm looking for? Incomplete, imperfect city is.
Yeah, for sure. And then also I think just building on that too, right? Because a private city isn't it's not necessarily like its goal is profit at the end of the day. If it's a private city, it's trying to generate as much profit as possible. Essentially you'll be building cities for the rich and a particular type of person,
Yeah.
particular type of citizen. That's definitely that's an interesting point. And it seems to me that there's kind of this struggle between fairness and efficiency, where you have a private city which might be efficient because the supported private cities will often cite issues of governance in cities like Toronto, with the struggle between the bottom-up interests of the citizens, and different groups and advocacy groups, and the top-down governance of the city and the decision makers. And this ongoing struggle in practically every city around the world is for, supporters of private cities. That's a downfall of the city, of the current model of the city. What's your take on that? Is there some benefit to that kind of, things get done a bit slower, but there's that constant kind of almost like a dance or tango between different elements. And if so, what is that benefit?
Yeah, you always hear from, like, there's always certain councillors or mayors in different cities, Toronto included, that's like this, we need to run the government like a business. And maybe in some aspects that's like, yeah, sure, like you should have sound accounting practices and be able to budget and not totally go into a hole for everything. But if you ran it like a business, like you'd never run buses to certain parts of the city that don't make, or subways and other transit things to parts of the city that don't make money, right? So you'd leave out a whole chunk of people. And who would those people be? They'd probably be, lower income people. And so government, like the services that a city provides, and cities are really about service delivery in many ways, it would not be a great business to be in, but people require it, and the city requires it to survive, which allows for other actual businesses to flourish. So, I mean, you always get that push and pull between different factions on city councils about that, but ultimately, this beast that we live in is not a business.
No, that's interesting. And I think also that's a pretty good segue into reconsidering, in a sense, what we mean by smart city to begin with, right? Because often in the case of Sidewalk Labs especially, this means technologically very advanced. So whether it's, garbage bins that have LED lights and close when they're full, or sidewalks that heat up to melt snow, traffic lights that, figure out the daily transportation patterns, and so on and so on. I'm not a tech expert by any means, but, all this cool tech that you hear of. But let's look at the case of, Quayside and Toronto Waterfront. Sure, the garbage bins don't have Wi-Fi or anything, but you did mention considerable changes in the last 2 decades. Can you explain how the waterfront has become better in substantial ways for people living there?
Well, you look at some of what's been built in the last 10 years, especially, it kind of ramped up really quickly. There's like whole new neighborhoods along the lake. A nice lakeside path that connects it all. Some really nice parks like Sherburne Common, and a few others that are so new that their name falls out of my head, except for Corktown Common, which is really magnificent, built on a flood control berm at the mouth of the Don River. Now it's this lovely park with great views of downtown and this whole wetland. And a lot of like the smart city things that Google was proposing, they could happen anyway. We have all these local tech firms or Canadian tech firms, or not even Canadian tech firms, that could do this. So if Waterfront Toronto wanted to try these pilot projects, they could, right? We didn't necessarily need Google to do them. So all that stuff is still there. But the whole term smart city, it's like one of those things that means everything and nothing. You hear it thrown around, and you see it. It's like it became kind of a very sexy thing because it's often associated with tech, I think. That a sexy thing that a politician could say to seem like they're future thinking, and it's nice to put on a sign. Welcome to, I go to Malta a lot to visit my dad where he lives. And Malta has a smart city program. I remember seeing the signs everywhere in Malta, smart city, over this way. And I went there and it wasn't built yet. Just like it was like the word meant everything. But I don't know. To me, a smart city, it doesn't necessarily have to be about technology. It can, but it's about a city that can adapt and listen to the needs of the people and businesses in it. Cities are sometimes slow at listening and adapting and doing the right thing. A smart city would react more intelligently, whether it's a technological solution or some old-fashioned solution.
Yeah, that's interesting. Even just north of Toronto, Markham, you enter, the sign says the tech capital of Ontario. I think tech capital of Ontario, which is always interesting to me, seeing that almost every day.
But again, they're branding themselves, so they're competing, right? They're like new tech startups, come up to Markham, don't go downtown Toronto. So it's
we had the future home of Amazon sign on the Markham sign for a long time. It didn't happen, but the sign was there for months and months after as well. It's interesting you mentioned, I guess, kind of reevaluating what smart means, because even looking at places in Toronto, like I've seen Toronto change in the last maybe as a kid you don't necessarily remember all the things, and you don't really pay attention to it, but even in the last 5-6 years I've seen the city gets smarter without the tech aspect. Just 2 weeks ago I was on the Brimley and they added bike lanes just 2 weeks ago, and that's just an infinitely smarter road for pedestrians and cyclists now than it was before, and there's no LED lights or anything like that there, so that's super interesting. And you mentioned that cities today, even in a sense, are competing with one another for citizens. And there's this issue of sometimes accessibility because you're trying to attract capital, you're trying to attract businesses and whatnot. Um, and you also mentioned, I guess, the underserved parts of Toronto as well, where for example, in Scarborough, doesn't have transportation isn't as good as it could be, and it's something that we've kind of dragged our feet on for years and years. Um, so in the existing model as well, are there areas you think where things like accessibility and equity could improve because there's this kind of desire to make the most money, or is that not really a concern?
It is a concern, not to everyone, but it should be a concern. The equity part of it, there's increasing, the studies, I think the most well-known is probably the Three Cities of Toronto by a researcher, Old Cities Institute, which was renamed at the University of Toronto, looking at how the middle class shrunk and the lower income population really grew, as did the very top, right? And that's an imbalance that all the success that this city, Toronto, has enjoyed, that has the potential to upend it, right? If not everyone is brought along on that journey to wealth, things, historically and badly. If you have high youth unemployment, any city that has high youth unemployment, they have trouble. When you have a bleak future, that's when you get civil unrest and that sort of thing. So the equity thing, it should be just even for selfish reasons rather than altruistic. Never mind altruistic reasons, that everyone deserves the same kind of chance. Just selfishly, you don't want your city to be really unequal. As well, accessibility. It's like kind of the whole right to the city thing. If the city is not designed in a way that that allows everyone just physical access to it, but also just feeling comfortable in it and feeling like it's theirs, feeling like they can walk down the street with the same amount of liberty and freedom as someone else. And that's been proven in Toronto to be quite untrue, just from something like police carding, right? I've said this anecdote a few times, that writing a column in the Star and elsewhere about exploring Toronto. I've explored the city in the middle of the night, walking down alleys, taking pictures of things because it's kind of how I take notes often. I've never ever been, stopped by a cop. They pass and look and keep going, despite me looking, at least I think, behaving suspiciously. There's,
Yeah.
Other people who are just, young men of color walking down the street, not doing stupid things like I'm doing, will get stopped, right? So that is a basic, how would the way that would change your relationship to the place you live in, right? I can walk down the street and think it's sort of mine, right? Or it's comfortable, this is where I belong. I think it would only take being stopped once arbitrarily like that to make that feeling of connection to the place evaporate. So again, even if it's not affecting you selfishly, you want people who live in the city to feel like it's theirs, to contribute to it. And if the actual functions of the official city, in this case the police, is making people feel detached from it, that's not good for anyone.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the Three Cities report. Interestingly, that's I think it's Halchansky, Professor
Yep.
Halchansky, who he gave a guest lecture in one of my courses, and that's kind of where I went down this rabbit hole of urbanism and urban issues in Toronto. So it's interesting you mentioned that, and yeah, for sure, it's definitely it's very eye opening to see kind of the changes of Toronto.
Yeah, and the what's interesting is that he had a lot of maps in it, right? And so you
Yeah.
could really visualize where this was. What was interesting about the Three Cities is that the mapping of that kind of lower income increase in Toronto, that mapping really overlapped nicely with where, say, Rob Ford's support was in 2010. So there's a correlation between what's going on economically and socially in the city and how it manifests politically. And Rob Ford was a master of telling people, you've been left out. These fat cats, these shiny people downtown, or whatever it was, creative class, or he was better at articulating it. He made people understand that these people are having a better life in the city, and we feel left out. I think that's what you mentioned, the Scarborough bad transit. You know, it's hard to get around Scarborough. It's gigantic. If you fold Scarborough over the rest of the city, it almost goes to the end of Etobicoke. It's huge.
Wow.
And so saying something like a subway, everyone understands what a subway is like, despite it being, I think, a bad plan because it was tiny and it only hit a little bit of Scarborough. Saying a subway is something that people can kind of get behind because that makes sense. I don't know, Rob Ford was by accident, by design. He was like a master communicator, and he had this political magic. But it was interesting the way it overlapped with those three cities reports, maps.
Yeah, and then even with the subway issue, like the LRT, the Eglinton LRT, for example, which was cancelled. I think just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the bus lanes on Eglinton interestingly follow the exact same route of the LRT, right? Which kind of goes to show if these decisions were made, a couple of years ago, construction would be well underway. You'd be, pretty much close to being done, instead of kind of delaying, and then having these band-aid solutions later on. That's interesting you mentioned that. And then also, I wanted to, in terms of the Three Cities report too, right? You kind of see where the wealthy in Toronto are is where the best service is, as it is too, right? For example, just in the recent news, kind of in Richmond Hill, they were against these new apartments being built, right? These kind of mixed model housing. And Richmond Hill is one of the areas I really wanted a subway line, right? So now you have these empty subway cars going north into the suburbs of Toronto. But when it comes time to increase the density and increase housing, that's where you kind of get the pushback, which is, I want to get your thoughts on that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you had it in Scarborough too. Some of the politicians who were gung-ho about the Scarborough subway, some of them are gone now, or at least not elected. They're still around somewhere. When it came to, will you upzone this area around the subway station for increased density, they were against the density, for all the NIMBY, not in my backyard reasons that these places do that. So you get this out of whack thing, which Toronto sometimes has, of running subway, heavy duty subway, like the heavy dutyest urban rail you can get, level of rail. And the stops are surrounded by single family homes. You look out the Danforth. The Danforth subway opened in 1966. Numerous subway stops from Broadview on down are really like one house up from the subway station is a single family home with a front yard and backyard. That's wild, right? And that will possibly repeat in Scarborough, and it will possibly repeat in Richmond Hill. So the planning, the transit planning and politics, the transit planning is very politically driven, but then the politics doesn't drive what's needed to make the thing a success later, or make it worthwhile doing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me at least like a lot of the people supporting new subway lines and new transit lines, and the ones that do end up being built are often the ones where the constituents are mostly people that have their own cars that that drive to work currently, want an easier way to get to work, and they live in single detached homes and whatnot. And never really the people who actually need the subway lines or the LRT or whatnot, which is interesting how that works in terms of who the city is for. And you mentioned access to the city as well, and kind of, I guess, tying it back to where we started with the private-public kind of tension. So recently the plan for the community hub on Jane and Finch was cancelled. So where do you think that went wrong? Is it just because we left it in the hands of Metrolinx? Is it lack of legislation? Or is it just, one of those unfortunate things that kind of, happens?
I think we don't have enough information exactly with Metrolinx. I suspect and others that it's political, sell this land that was dedicated for the Jane Finch Community Hub, sell it for market value, and it has good market value. And this is a provincial government that is into such things. So maybe it came that way, and we don't know yet. I suspect these things come out later as people talk. The Freedom of Information Acts are filed, and you get emails and things. But it kind of seemed political because it was such a egregious flip flop, and the messaging from Metrolinx that this is it was just like a whim of a bureaucrat that was operating with too much authority, is in contrast to like the actual planning. Like there were architectural renderings and meetings, and looking at the anger of the community, and the anger of some of the organizations that have worked with Metrolinx. And the one I'm thinking in particular is the Toronto Community Benefits Network, which gets large construction projects like the Eglinton LRT to hire locally, so young people can find a way into the trades and this sort of thing if they don't have a family connection to it. It's actually like a really good thing for youth employment. And they were upset about this too. So when you've pissed off the community that you should have had trust, that should have had your trust or trust in you, and pissed off some of your allies, organizations, something is definitely wrong there.
Yeah. And I know this is purely speculative, just because at this point it is hard to tell exactly what happened and what went on behind the scenes. But often for a project like this, where a company will make a promise to, do something for the community, what is the reason behind that? Is it for a concession from the city for building? Is it to get better, get better treatment? Just what's the thought process behind a promise like this one?
Often, for these large mega projects, it's not just about the rail line, it's about how does this, this is going to be highly disruptive to our community, and there's people who probably don't want it generally, and so like there's all these concessions are made, like, well, it'll come with this and it'll come with this. Sometimes these things are parks and other community improvements, and in this case it was a community hub, a community center in a part of Toronto that is underserved for those sorts of things. So it was an especially, I think, valuable, worthwhile thing to dangle in front of a community, which I think also speaks to why the outrage is so profound.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's pretty much what I had for you today. I appreciate you coming on. This is actually the first episode I'm recording, so it was a new experience for me as well.
You're smooth. That's good.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just to end, I'll have you kind of just let the audience know what you have going on, where they can keep up with your work, anything like that.
What am I doing? It's the summer of 2010. It's 2020, sorry.
Yeah.
The pandemic is making time go backwards, not just slow down.
Yeah, we'll be a 2020 on loop for repeat forever.
Yeah, I write a column in the Toronto Star, a weekly column in the Toronto Star about the city. Sometimes it goes in Saturday, sometimes Monday, wherever it fits. And I'm one of the editors at Spacing magazine, spacing.ca, so people can go there and see more coverage of how our city is becoming. And I teach, getting ready to teach online at U of T in the fall, which is a little daunting. I'd rather walk down the street and see everyone in real life like everyone else.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's it from us this week. Be sure to check out Shawn's work. You can keep up with him on Twitter and Instagram at Shawn Micallef. Also, be sure to follow City and Crumpets on Twitter at City Crumpets to get the latest updates on speakers, episodes, and more content. That's it from us this week. Thank you and goodbye. This is a project funded by the School of Cities at the University of Toronto.